Carlos, as people fondly called him, though that wasn't his real name, was born and raised in the bustling Sango Ota area of Ogun State, Nigeria. From a young age, he stood out as one of those rare students whose brilliance shone effortlessly. His teachers admired him for his sharp memory and deep sense of focus, while his classmates respected him for his quiet confidence and consistency. During his secondary school years, Carlos was the kind of student who rarely got distracted. While many of his mates divided their attention between academics, social life, and teenage excitement, Carlos devoted almost all his energy to his books. He had a clear goal: to excel, make his family proud, and rise above the limitations of his background. His effort paid off handsomely. When the West African Examinations Council released results that year, Carlos's name was on everyone's lips. He scored 6 A's and 3 B's, an extraordinary result that placed him among the best students not just in his school, but in the entire state. His performance drew the attention of the Ogun State government, which was so impressed that they awarded him a full scholarship to study chemistry at the University of Agriculture. For Carlos, this was a dream come true, a reward for years of hard work, sleepless nights, and determination. When he arrived at the university, Carlos carried with him the same disciplined mindset he had always lived by. He had no interest in distractions or unnecessary social life. His goal was simple: study hard, graduate with flying colors, and make his people back home proud. At first, everything went according to plan. He attended lectures regularly, spent most of his evenings at the library, and quickly earned the admiration of some of his lecturers. However, life on campus has a way of testing even the most focused minds. For Carlos, the test came from a familiar source: his old friends from Sango Ota. They were people he had grown up with, boys who once shared his dreams and ambitions. But things had changed over the years. While Carlos had remained dedicated to education, his friends had taken a different path. By the time he reunited with them on campus, many of them had become deeply involved in a certain campus movement, a secret brotherhood that was far from the innocent friendships they once shared. Though Carlos was aware that his friends were no longer the same, he couldn't easily distance himself from them. They had shared too much history, childhood memories, laughter, and struggles. Out of loyalty, he continued to move with them, often hanging out around the hostel, attending parties, and engaging in casual conversations that slowly began to shape his thoughts. At first, it seemed harmless. But as time went on, Carlos found himself spending less time at the library and more time in the company of these friends. Their influence began to rub off on him in subtle ways. The once disciplined young man who came to the university with a clear mission slowly started to lose focus. He didn't realize it immediately, but his association with those friends would later turn out to be one of the biggest mistakes of his life, a decision that would change his story forever. Carlos's story began to take a different turn not long after he settled into university life. Though he was a student of the University of Agriculture, most of his old friends were schooling at Moshood Abiola Polytechnic, a nearby institution known for its lively social scene and strong presence of various student groups. These were the same friends he had grown up with back in Sango Ota, friends who had once shared his dreams and goals but had now taken a completely different path. They were no longer the studious boys he used to know. They had become deeply involved in a group on campus known as the Airlords movement. Because of their closeness, Carlos found himself visiting Moshood Abiola Polytechnic frequently. What started as casual weekend visits gradually turned into a routine. He would leave his own campus and spend days, sometimes weeks, hanging around his friends at the Polytechnic. To him, it felt like a second home, a place where he was surrounded by familiar faces and people who made him feel accepted and respected. At first, the influence seemed harmless. They laughed together, shared meals, and talked about life. But as time went on, Carlos began to notice how different their lifestyle was from his. His friends lived with a kind of boldness and freedom that fascinated him. They had a sense of power and unity that seemed to command respect wherever they went. To a young man like Carlos, brilliant but still trying to find his place in the world, this display of confidence had its appeal. Because he was known for his intelligence, his friends began to rely on him in ways that blurred the line between friendship and exploitation. During examination periods, whenever one of their group members couldn't make it to school or was unavailable, Carlos was called upon to help. Using his academic skills, he started writing exams on behalf of others, a role that earned him the nickname Machinery. It was a risky act, but at that time, he didn't think much of it. To him, it was just helping his friends. To them, it was proof that Carlos could be useful to their circle. As months passed, the persuasion began. His friends, impressed by his loyalty and intelligence, started urging him to become part of their brotherhood. They told him that joining them would bring him closer to people who looked out for one another, people who had his back in any situation. They painted a picture of strength, unity, and lifelong protection. But deep inside, Carlos was torn. He knew that becoming a member of such a group would change his life forever. The decision wasn't made overnight. It took months of back-and-forth discussions, promises, and emotional pressure. Each time he visited the Polytechnic, they reminded him that he already acted like one of them, that it was only right for him to make it official. Gradually, their words began to sink in. Carlos convinced himself that maybe joining them wasn't such a bad idea. After all, they were his longtime friends, and he trusted them. Eventually, he gave in. The day he made that decision marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with experiences far beyond what he had imagined. From that moment, Carlos was no longer just a brilliant university student, he was now part of a movement that demanded loyalty, secrecy, and complete dedication. He quickly realized that the life he had just stepped into came with heavy responsibilities and unseen consequences. As a new member, he was now considered an enforcer, someone expected to stand firm and represent the group at all times. This automatically made him a target to rival groups across different campuses. Suddenly, his once peaceful life became unpredictable. He had unknowingly walked into a world where every move mattered, and every friendship came with hidden risks. Carlos had traded his freedom, the quiet, focused life of a promising scholar, for a life of tension, uncertainty, and silent battles. The brilliant boy who once dreamed of making his community proud was now living in a reality far from what he had ever imagined. And though he didn't realize it immediately, this single choice would go on to shape the rest of his life in ways he could never reverse. The year 2009 would become a turning point in Carlos's life, a year that would mark the beginning of his greatest downfall. It was the same year he gained admission into the University of Agriculture on a full scholarship from the Ogun State government, and also the same year he officially joined the Airlords group after months of persuasion from his friends. He was still in his first year on campus, young, ambitious, and full of dreams, yet completely unaware that a storm was already brewing, one that would soon consume everything he had worked for. Not long after he became part of the group, tension broke out between the Airlords and another rival group known as the Buccaneers. What began as small confrontations on different campuses across the state soon grew into a full-blown conflict. The situation was especially intense in Abeokuta, where both groups had strong members. Reports of clashes, retaliations, and growing unrest spread quickly among students and residents alike. Carlos, however, was not in Abeokuta at the time. He was in Sango Ota, his hometown, trying to stay away from the chaos. But even from a distance, he was still connected to the activities of his group. Before things escalated, some of his fellow members had entrusted him with something serious, a pump-action firearm. They had asked him to keep it safe for them, in case it would be needed during emergencies or conflicts. To Carlos, it was simply a favor to his brothers, something he never thought would drag him into deeper trouble. But one afternoon, Carlos received a call that would change everything. It was from a senior member of the Airlords who was also his close friend. The man sounded urgent and tense. He told Carlos that the situation in Abeokuta had become very serious, that their members were being attacked and they needed all the support they could get. He instructed Carlos to bring the firearm to Abeokuta immediately. At first, Carlos hesitated. He knew it was risky, but his loyalty to the group clouded his judgment. In his mind, he was helping his people, the same people who once stood for him. Without overthinking it, he packed the weapon carefully inside a bag, boarded a commercial bus heading to Abeokuta, and began the journey. Along the way, the atmosphere in the bus was calm. Passengers chatted quietly, and Carlos sat by the window, lost in thought. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but it was too late to turn back. As the bus approached the police checkpoint, the officer signaled for it to stop. It was a normal routine, or so everyone thought. The officers began their usual inspection, checking passengers one after another. But when they got to Carlos, one of them noticed the bag beside him looked heavy. They asked him to open it. Nervously, Carlos obeyed. The moment the bag was unzipped, the officer's expressions changed. Inside was the pump-action firearm he had been asked to deliver. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. Carlos was pulled out of the vehicle, questioned, and then handcuffed. No amount of explanation could save him. He tried to tell them that the item wasn't his, that he was only keeping it for someone, but the officers weren't interested in hearing any story. He was taken straight to the station, where the reality of his situation began to sink in. Days later, Carlos was formally charged to court. The evidence against him was strong, and with no one to stand by him or testify in his favor, the judgment came quickly. He was sentenced to serve time in prison. Just like that, the brilliant young man who had once been the pride of his community and the beneficiary of a government scholarship found himself behind bars. Carlos spent 5 long years in prison. The days were slow, and each night felt longer than the last. In that place, he had enough time to reflect on every decision that had brought him there, the friends he trusted, the choices he made, and the dreams he had abandoned. By the time he finally regained his freedom in 2014, everything he once had was gone. His scholarship was terminated, his admission withdrawn, and his name forgotten by the people who once celebrated his success. But even after all that, Carlos's story did not end there. Returning to the outside world, he found it difficult to fit back into normal life. The world had moved on without him. With no school to return to and no clear direction, he began to wander again, moving between Abeokuta and Sango Ota, reconnecting with familiar faces from the past. Unfortunately, instead of turning over a new leaf, Carlos drifted deeper into the street life, opening a new and far more dangerous chapter of his story, one that would test his survival and shape his destiny in ways he never imagined. When Carlos finally regained his freedom and returned to Sango Ota in 2014, the world he once knew had completely changed. The streets where he had grown up, the same streets filled with childhood memories and familiar faces, were no longer the same. Many of his old friends had either disappeared, moved on with their lives, or become deeply involved in street politics and rival movements. The calm and innocence that once defined the area had been replaced by tension, mistrust, and an unspoken struggle for dominance among different groups. Carlos had left as a young, brilliant student with dreams of building a successful future. But after 5 long years behind bars, he returned as a man hardened by experience. Life in prison had changed his perspective. He was no longer naive about the realities of the world. Yet, deep inside, there was still a quiet part of him that wished he could go back to the days before everything went wrong. Unfortunately, the streets had a way of pulling him back in. Not long after his return, Carlos reconnected with some of his old friends from the Airlords group. One of them, the same person who had called him years earlier to bring the firearm to Abeokuta, had risen through the ranks and was now the leader of the Airlords in the Ijoko area of Sango Ota. Within the group, this leadership position was known as the Iboka, a title given only to those who held the highest authority in a particular zone or deck. This old friend had not forgotten what Carlos went through because of him. He carried a heavy sense of guilt, believing that Carlos's imprisonment had been a direct result of the assignment he had sent him on 5 years earlier. So when it was time for him to hand over leadership, he made a decision that would once again alter Carlos's destiny. He chose Carlos as his successor. For many, this seemed like an act of loyalty, a way to compensate a friend who had suffered for the group. But not everyone saw it that way. Some people around Carlos cautioned him to think twice before accepting such a position. One of them was a close friend known on the streets as Spiritual, a calm, wise man who had seen too many lives destroyed by the endless rivalries among groups. Spiritual warned Carlos that becoming the leader of the Ijoko deck would put a heavy target on his back. He explained that the area was in constant conflict with members of a rival movement known as the Black Axe. Taking up leadership, he said, would make Carlos one of their main targets. But Carlos, confident and determined, brushed off the warning. To him, stepping into leadership felt like a way to regain respect and control of his life. After all, he had endured pain, prison, and betrayal. Perhaps, in his mind, this was his time to be in charge. And so, despite the risks, he accepted the mantle of leadership and officially became the new Iboka of the Airlords in Ijoko, Sango Ota. From that point onward, Carlos's name began to echo throughout the streets. His reputation grew quickly. Some saw him as a fearless leader, others as a man to be avoided. Under his leadership, the group became more organized and influential. His connections expanded beyond the local streets. Soon, he was noticed by some powerful political figures who saw his influence as useful. They began reaching out to him for favors, small tasks during elections, helping to mobilize people for campaigns, or maintaining order during political events. These activities brought Carlos both money and attention, but they also drew him deeper into the dangerous web of street politics. He was living a life of power and influence, yet far from peace. Deep inside, he sometimes thought about what his life could have been if he had stayed focused on his education. Then came a moment of hope, a chance to leave everything behind. Through some of his political connections, Carlos was able to secure a visa to travel to the United Kingdom. It was the kind of opportunity most people only dream about, a chance at a fresh start, away from the dangers and chaos of street life. But for reasons known only to him, Carlos kept postponing the trip. Each time, he found one reason or another to delay his departure. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, until the visa finally expired and used. The opportunity was gone. Shortly after, trouble returned to the streets. Tension between the Airlords and the Black Axe members flared up once again, this time more intense than before. Both sides were prepared for confrontation, and every leader was a potential target. Carlos, being the Iboka, was at the top of that list. One unfortunate day, he was ambushed. The rival group struck with precision, and Carlos did not make it out alive. It was a tragic end to a life that had once held so much promise. The same boy who once brought pride to his family through his brilliance in school, who once earned a government scholarship, was now gone, his dreams cut short by choices that led him down a dangerous path. Carlos's story is a painful reminder of how easily one wrong decision can change the course of a life. He could have been a great scientist, a lecturer, or a successful professional. Instead, his name became another sad story whispered in the streets of Sango Ota. Let this story be a lesson to every young person out there: say no to cultism, say no to violence, and say yes to peace. The streets might promise power, but in the end, they only take more than they give. Choose education. Choose peace. Choose life.